The Bennett family home stood peaceful under the fading light of dusk, a serene suburban house nestled amidst the quiet neighborhood. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, the sound of laughter filling the air. Sophie Bennett sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as her daughter Emma played on her tablet in the living room. Liam, her husband, was in the garage, working on his car, his footsteps faintly echoing through the walls. Everything seemed normal, until, without warning, the shattering sound of glass pierced the calm. A bullet. The window facing the front yard exploded with a deafening crash, sending shards of glass scattering across the room. Sophie gasped, her heart racing as she turned toward the source of the noise. Emma screamed in terror, instinctively shrinking into herself, while Sophie's body froze for a fraction of a second. In that moment, the world outside their home seemed to spin, its security ripped away in an instant. "Sophie!" Liam shouted from the garage, rushing toward the house, his voice tinged with panic. Sophie's protective instincts kicked in immediately. She dove toward Emma, pulling her close, shielding her fragile body with her own. The impact of the bullet hadn't reached them, but the shattered glass and the noise had left their home feeling like a war zone. She held Emma tight, her mind racing with 100 thoughts, none of them making sense. Liam burst into the room, his eyes wide with fear, scanning the area. He dropped to his knees beside Sophie and Emma, his voice shaking as he whispered, "Are you both okay?" "We're fine," Sophie managed to reply, though her words felt hollow. Her gaze was locked on the now gaping hole in the window, as if expecting the next shot to come. Outside, the shrill wail of sirens began to grow louder. They were coming. The police. But in that moment, it felt like a lifetime away. The fear in Sophie's chest gripped her tightly as she looked at Emma's trembling form. She had to protect her. They had to stay safe. What the hell happened? Liam muttered under his breath, standing up and rushing to the window to get a better look outside. He squinted into the growing dusk, but saw nothing but shadows and the empty street. The house was silent, save for the distant sirens and the sound of Emma's frightened sobs. "I don't know," Sophie replied, her voice a whisper of disbelief. "Who would do this?" Her heart raced with a growing sense of dread. The HOA had been a constant issue, sure, but would it really escalate to something like this? A bullet through their window? It didn't make sense. Sophie's eyes darted toward the door, where she saw the faintest silhouette in the driveway, a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of the porch light. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Before she could say anything, Liam grabbed her arm. "We need to call the police," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Now!" But Sophie was already one step ahead. She had grabbed her phone the moment the shot was fired. She dialed 911, her hands trembling as she tried to keep her composure. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. Sophie could barely get the words out. "There's been a shooting. Someone fired through our window. We need help, please." "Stay calm. Help is on the way. Can you tell me if anyone is injured?" Sophie looked at Emma, still holding her tightly, her face pale with fear. "No, we're fine. But someone's out there. I don't know who, but they're still out there." The dispatcher gave her instructions, and Sophie followed them numbly. She had no idea who could have done this, but the question was burning in her mind. Was this just an accident? Or was someone out there waiting to finish what they started? As the sirens drew nearer, the tension in the air grew thick. The fear that had settled in Sophie's chest now spread like wildfire through the whole house. She hugged Emma tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. Someone had fired that shot. Someone had tried to hurt her family. But who? And why? The sirens were almost at their doorstep, but the answers, if they were out there, still felt miles away. It was a typical evening in the Bennett household. The sun was slowly sinking behind the distant hills, casting a warm amber glow across the small suburban street. Sophie Bennett sat in the living room, her eyes scanning over a recipe book, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She glanced toward the window, watching her daughter, Emma, as she rolled her wheelchair slowly along the sidewalk outside. The soft hum of suburban life surrounded them, the distant sound of children playing, dogs barking, and the occasional car passing by. It was peaceful, normal. But for Sophie, this quiet evening was a reminder of everything she had to protect. Emma, her 15-year-old daughter, was her world. Born with a rare disability that affected her legs, Emma had been in a wheelchair since she was young. Sophie had fought tooth and nail to ensure her daughter's life was as close to normal as possible, even if that meant making some sacrifices of her own. Every day, Sophie took on the weight of her worries, ensuring Emma was safe, happy, and most importantly, treated like any other teenager. Tonight, like most nights, Sophie sat on the couch, her attention half on Emma and half on the ticking clock. It was nearing dinner time, and she had prepared one of Emma's favorite meals, spaghetti with homemade marinara sauce. Liam, her husband, had just finished work and was coming home any minute. It was a simple evening, a brief interlude in their hectic lives. "Mom, I'm going to take a quick ride around the block," Emma called from outside, her voice light despite the heaviness of the chair she sat in. Sophie looked up from the recipe book and smiled warmly, though her protective instinct stirred. "Be careful, Emma," she called back, watching her daughter's wheels spin with a steady rhythm. Emma was an independent spirit, and that always made Sophie proud. But it also made her heart ache with the knowledge that her daughter had to fight harder than most to experience those small freedoms. Sophie turned back to the book, but her thoughts lingered on her daughter. She knew Emma would be fine, but still, she couldn't help the constant worry that lingered in the back of her mind. A light tap at the door made her snap out of her reverie. She opened it to find Liam standing there, briefcase in hand, looking tired but content. His eyes softened when he saw her, and he dropped the briefcase on the couch before pulling Sophie into a gentle hug. "Long day?" Sophie asked, half smiling as she stepped back, looking up at her husband. "You could say that." Liam grinned, running a hand through his hair. "But nothing beats coming home to you two." Sophie smiled back, her worries momentarily lifted by his presence. She watched as he set about removing his coat and shoes, making his way to the kitchen. "That smells amazing," Liam said, peeking over her shoulder at the simmering pot of marinara sauce. Sophie let out a small laugh, relieved that Liam could still find joy in the little things despite his demanding work schedule. As he went to prepare his plate, Sophie's mind briefly wandered to their neighbor, Karen McDonald. Sophie had always felt a strange unease around her. Something about Karen's self-righteousness rubbed her the wrong way. She was the HOA president after all, and that made her a constant presence in their lives. Karen had the power to dictate the rules, and Sophie couldn't help but feel that Karen enjoyed her authority a little too much. In the past few months, Karen had been increasingly critical of the Bennett family. It started with small things, comments about their lawn being unruly or Emma's wheelchair being in the wrong spot on the sidewalk. Sophie had brushed it off at first, assuming Karen was simply the type of person who couldn't mind her own business. But lately, those little comments had turned into letters, formal complaints sent to the HOA accusing the Bennetts of breaking the neighborhood rules. The issues seemed trivial: a flower bed that was too close to the sidewalk, a fence that wasn't painted the right shade of beige. But for Karen, it was never just about the rules. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something personal behind Karen's actions, something hidden beneath the surface of her perfect, polished facade. "I saw Karen again today," Sophie said, stirring the pot absently. "She's at it again." Liam paused mid-bite, frowning. "What now?" "More complaints about the garden, of course. And she's questioning where Emma parks her chair in front of the house." Liam shook his head, his brow furrowed. "She's really been on our case lately. You've already done everything right. There's nothing more we can do about it." Sophie sighed, her thoughts heavy. She knew Liam was right, but she couldn't help but feel trapped. The HOA had too much power in their neighborhood, and Karen wielded it like a sword. She couldn't fathom how someone could be so petty, so controlling. And what was it about her that seemed so eager to make life difficult for their family? "Maybe it's time we had a talk with her," Liam suggested, his voice calm but firm. Sophie shook her head. "I don't think talking will do much good. She's not the kind of person who listens. Just then, the faint sound of wheels on pavement reached their ears. Sophie turned to the window and saw Emma heading back toward the house, her wheelchair moving at a steady pace. Sophie smiled again, though a part of her remained uneasy. She glanced at Liam, who had already returned his meal, and her thoughts briefly turned back to Karen. The world outside their window seemed peaceful, but Sophie knew better. The storm was brewing, and the calm before it was only a fleeting moment. What had started as minor complaints could quickly turn into something more dangerous, and Sophie couldn't help but wonder what Karen's true motives were. For now, the evening continued as planned, calm, quiet, and predictable. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't stay this way for long. It was a bright Saturday morning, the kind that made the world feel fresh and full of possibility. Sophie was in the front yard, kneeling by the flower bed, carefully tending to the roses that had bloomed with vibrant reds and soft pinks. Emma, in her wheelchair, was parked by the driveway, her tablet in hand, while Liam worked on a project in the garage. It was peaceful, too peaceful, perhaps for the storm that was about to unfold. Sophie glanced up from her gardening, her hand frozen mid-reach for the pruning shears. She saw the familiar figure of Karen McDonald striding down the sidewalk toward them, her stiff posture and sharp features always a telltale sign of trouble. Karen was the kind of person who carried her authority like a badge, one that often made people uncomfortable, especially in the close-knit community they lived in. Sophie straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans, bracing herself for what she knew was coming. Karen had been eyeing their front yard for weeks. First, it was the garden gnomes, then the placement of Emma's wheelchair. Sophie had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about the rules anymore. It felt personal. "Good morning, Karen," Sophie called out, her tone polite but weary. She knew the drill by now. Karen didn't return the greeting. Instead, she walked right up to Sophie, her face scrunched in disapproval. "You're going to want to move that," she said sharply, pointing toward Emma's wheelchair, which was parked just a few feet from the sidewalk, near the edge of their front yard. Sophie blinked, confused. "What? The chair?" "Yes, the chair," Karen replied, her tone dripping with disdain. "It's blocking the sidewalk. The HOA has a clear policy about keeping the walkways clear. It's a safety hazard." Sophie stood up, dusting off her knees, trying to remain calm despite the irritation bubbling inside her. "Emma's wheelchair doesn't block the sidewalk," she said, her voice steady but firm. "She's parked it to the side. No one has ever had a problem with it before." "Oh, I've had plenty of complaints," Karen shot back, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "People don't like the way it's positioned. And frankly, I'm getting tired of you ignoring the rules." Sophie's chest tightened. "Karen, we've talked about this before. Emma's chair has never been an issue until now. She has every right to be out here, just like anyone else." Karen took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "Well, maybe it's time you start following the rules for once. The HOA is about keeping this community pristine, and your behavior has been problematic to say the least. I'm just trying to help you, Sophie. You should be grateful." Sophie felt a surge of frustration wash over her, the words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. Karen had always been condescending, but this was something else. It was as though Karen believed she had the right to dictate every aspect of their lives. "I don't need your help, Karen," Sophie said, her voice now rising in frustration. "I'll move the chair if it's actually a problem for someone, but this is just your obsession with control. You've been picking on us for weeks." Karen's face hardened, her lips twisting into a cold, satisfied smile. "Well, maybe it's time I escalate this. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA. And trust me, I'll make sure they take it seriously this time." Sophie clenched her fists at her sides, fighting to hold back the anger threatening to spill over. "You can file all the complaints you want, Karen, but you can't keep pushing us around. We're not going to stand for it." "Watch me," Karen retorted, her voice cutting like ice. "And don't think for a second that I won't take this further, if I have to. The HOA is my domain, Sophie. Don't forget that." With a final, disdainful glance, Karen turned on her heel and walked away, her step stiff with purpose. Sophie stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, watching her retreat. The encounter left a bitter taste in her mouth. She could feel the tension lingering in the air, thick and suffocating. Emma, who had been quietly observing the confrontation from her spot by the driveway, looked up at her mother with wide eyes. "Mom, is she really going to make us move the chair?" Sophie sighed, trying to mask her frustration with a smile. "No, sweetie, we'll be fine, but I think things are just going to keep getting worse with Karen." Liam, having overheard the last part of the conversation, appeared in the doorway of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "I heard," he said, shaking his head. "That woman's a piece of work. But Sophie, don't let her get to you. We've got rights too." Sophie nodded, but her thoughts were already racing. This wasn't just about a chair anymore. Karen had crossed a line, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The evening had turned cool, the kind of crisp nightfall that promised a sharp breeze in the air. Inside the Bennett household, Sophie and Liam had just settled at the dinner table, the clinking of silverware filling the quiet air. Emma was finishing her meal, chatting animatedly about school, her face bright with excitement of a day well spent. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settled into a peaceful rhythm as the night began to unfold. Outside, the neighborhood had quieted down, the sounds of children playing and lawnmowers drifting into the past. Everything seemed calm, almost too calm. Sophie absent-mindedly gazed out the window, the dim light from the street lamp illuminating the front yard. She caught a brief glimpse of the familiar figure of Karen McDonald strolling past the driveway, her brisk walk unmistakable. Sophie's stomach churned at the sight. It had been a few days since Karen's last confrontation about Emma's wheelchair, and Sophie had hoped it was the last they'd hear of it. But with Karen, peace was never permanent. Sophie's instincts told her to prepare for another clash, but she dismissed the thought as irrational. She focused back on the dinner table, shaking off the feeling of unease that had begun to gnaw at her. But then the knock came. It was sharp, insistent, and oddly cold in its urgency. Sophie stood up from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'll get it," she said, trying to sound calm, though a tightness had settled in her chest. Liam raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything, his eyes lingering on her as if waiting for something more. She approached the door, cautiously, hesitating for just a moment before opening it. Standing on the other side was Karen. But this time, something was different. Her usual sneer was replaced with an unreadable expression, her lips pressed tight as though she were holding back something dangerous. "Karen," Sophie said, her voice laced with suspicion but still polite. "What is it now?" Karen didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood there, her eyes flicking nervously toward the street before locking onto Sophie's. "I've had enough of your defiance, Sophie," she said coldly, her words sharp like knives. "You've ignored my warnings, and now I'm here to take matters into my own hands." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, confusion and dread mixing in her gut. "What do you mean by that?" she asked cautiously, her body instinctively stepping back toward the doorway, blocking the view into the house. "I'm not here to argue," Karen snapped, her voice rising with anger. "I'm here to settle this once and for all." Before Sophie could respond, Karen's hand moved quickly from behind her back. At first, Sophie thought she had a piece of paper or some kind of tool, but then she saw it, a gun. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, the reality of the situation sinking in like a cold wave. "Karen, what are you doing?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling as she instinctively stepped back into the house, glancing toward Liam, who was now standing behind her, confusion and fear creeping into his eyes. "I told you I would escalate it if necessary," Karen hissed, her eyes wild, her grip tightening on the gun. "I gave you every chance. But you didn't listen." Sophie felt her blood run cold as she took a step back, raising her hands in a defensive gesture, though she knew it would do little to stop whatever was about to happen. "Please, Karen, we can figure this out." Without warning, Karen lifted the gun, aiming it toward the window behind Sophie. Time seemed to slow down as Sophie turned just in time to see Karen's finger pull the trigger. Bang! The deafening noise shattered the peaceful stillness of the night. Sophie screamed, ducking instinctively as the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. Emma's terrified cry rang out from the living room, and Liam's voice was drowned out by the rapid thud of Sophie's heartbeat pounding in her ears. Sophie fell to the floor, her heart racing, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She glanced toward the shattered window, glass strewn across the floor, the hole left by the bullet unmistakable. It had narrowly missed her. Liam, reacting on instinct, rushed forward and yanked Sophie out of the way, pulling her toward the living room. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice a low growl of fury. Sophie, disoriented and still reeling from the shock, scrambled to her feet, but Liam was already on the move, his focus sharp, his protective instincts kicking in. "Sophie, Emma," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency as he bolted into the living room, scanning for any sign of injury. Sophie followed closely, her legs shaky beneath her. She reached Emma, who was now cowering beneath the table, tears streaming down her face. Sophie dropped to her knees, pulling Emma into her arms, her own breath ragged with panic. "Mom, what happened?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Sophie could barely find the words to answer, her throat tight with the horror of what had just occurred. "It's okay, sweetie. We're safe," Sophie said as reassuringly as she could manage, her hands trembling as she stroked Emma's hair. Outside, the sound of Karen's footsteps retreated, the silence that followed only making the tension worse. Sophie's mind raced. What had Karen been trying to do? Had she meant to kill her to hurt Emma, or was it all part of some twisted, misguided vendetta? Liam's voice broke through the confusion, low and commanding. "Stay here, both of you. I'm calling the police." Sophie nodded numbly, still holding Emma tightly, her gaze fixed on the window where the bullet had pierced through. The room felt suffocating. The image of Karen, her gun aimed with such cold precision, replayed in Sophie's mind like a nightmare. Everything had changed in an instant. The calm suburban life they had known was gone, shattered like the glass on the floor. Sophie wanted to believe it was some sort of mistake, that Karen's actions were some bizarre act of rage that would be over soon, but deep down, Sophie knew this was just the beginning. The shooting wasn't just an attack on their home. It was an attack on everything they stood for: family, safety, and the idea that no one could control their lives with fear. Sophie looked down at Emma, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. "We'll be okay," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure if she believed it. "We'll make sure she doesn't hurt anyone else." As Liam dialed the police, Sophie knew this was far from over. The house was eerily quiet after the gunshot, save for the frantic rhythm of Sophie's breath and the sharp pulse of adrenaline racing through her veins. Her arms were still tightly wrapped around Emma, pulling her close as if to shield her from the nightmare unfolding before them. The shattered window loomed in the background, the jagged glass glistening under the dim light as a cruel reminder of how close they had come to disaster. "Emma, it's okay," Sophie whispered, though her voice betrayed the uncertainty gnawing at her. "You're safe, we're safe." She held her daughter tighter, as though her touch could somehow erase the fear that had consumed their home. But inside, Sophie's heart was anything but calm. Her body trembled, her nerves still on edge, every muscle in her frame fighting to process the shock that surged through her. The gunshot had come from nowhere. It had shattered their peace, and she couldn't shake the haunting image of Karen standing outside with a weapon aimed directly at them. The sound of glass breaking, the terror in Emma's eyes, it was all too much to process. Liam, ever the protector, was already moving. He had sprinted toward the window the moment the bullet had fired, his instinct sharp. Sophie barely registered his movements as she tried to steady Emma, but then Liam's voice broke through the haze of her panic. "It's all right," he called, his voice tight but controlled. "The bullet didn't hit anyone, but it's definitely lodged in the wall." He sounded shaken, but his professionalism was still there, focused on keeping the situation from spiraling further. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she glanced toward the window, still holding Emma close. Liam was already on the phone, talking to the police, his tone steady and urgent. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. This wasn't some minor dispute with a crazy neighbor anymore. It was real. Karen had tried to hurt them. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. Liam spoke quickly, his words coming in fast. There's been a shooting. A bullet came through our window. We need immediate assistance. There's no one hurt, but we need someone to come out and investigate. Sophie could hear the dispatcher on the other end, asking for more details, but all she could focus on was Emma's trembling form in her arms. Her daughter, usually full of life and energy, now seemed so small and fragile, her wide, terrified eyes locked onto Sophie's. "Mom, is she gone?" Emma's voice trembled, her question a whisper of pure fear. Sophie swallowed hard, her heart aching as she stroked Emma's hair. "No, sweetie, she's not gone." "It's okay," Sophie whispered back, though the words didn't come easy. "We're going to be okay. The police are on their way." Liam hung up the phone and moved toward them, kneeling down to take a look at Emma. His eyes softened as he reached out to touch her shoulder, his expression torn. "It's going to be fine, Emma," he said, his voice filled with more hope than certainty. "We'll get through this." Sophie glanced over at him, a mix of gratitude and guilt crossing her face. It wasn't just the physical threat of the gunshot that had shaken them, it was the sheer violation of their safety, the loss of control. Their home had been a sanctuary until now, a place where they should have been able to retreat from the world's chaos. But now, it had become the site of their greatest fear. The sound of sirens grew louder outside, and Sophie instinctively tightened her grip on Emma. The police were finally here, but that didn't make Sophie feel any safer. She couldn't forget Karen's face as she'd aimed the gun, that look of cold determination. Was Karen just a neighbor with a grudge, or was there something more to her, something more dangerous? As the sirens approached, the gravity of what had happened hit Sophie like a tidal wave. They had narrowly escaped being shot, and for what? Because of some petty HOA dispute, some vendetta? It seemed almost impossible to believe. She had known Karen for years. She had been nothing more than an overbearing, rule-obsessed woman. But this? Sophie had never imagined this level of violence. It was beyond anything she had ever anticipated. The police arrived quickly, their cars screeching to a halt outside the house. Officers rushed to the door, their faces a mix of professionalism and concern. One of them spoke immediately, taking control of the situation. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked as Sophie and Liam stepped aside to let them in. Sophie nodded numbly. "We're fine. It was a close call, but no one was hurt. We just need help with this situation." The officers exchanged a quick glance before one of them turned toward the window, inspecting the damage. "Where did the bullet hit?" he asked. Liam pointed toward the wall, behind the broken window. "Right there. It must have come in at an angle." The officer carefully examined the area. "This isn't just an accidental shot. Someone took aim." Sophie swallowed, her stomach turning. It was one thing to be angry, but this was something else entirely. "Karen McDonald did this," Sophie said, quietly, the words finally spilling out. "She's the one who shot at us." The officers nodded, jotting down notes. "We'll need to question her," one of them replied. "This is a serious offense, and we'll take it from here." Sophie watched as the officers began to secure the area, questioning Liam and taking down statements. The reality of the situation hit her harder now that the police were involved. She'd always thought they were above this kind of conflict, but now they were part of it. They had been victims, and nothing would ever feel quite the same again. As the police worked, Sophie couldn't help but wonder, how had they come to this? Could they really get justice for what had happened? Would Karen be held accountable? Or would this just become another twisted part of their neighborhood's ugly politics? Her thoughts were interrupted as Liam returned to her side, his face pale, but determined. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to make sure this ends, Sophie. No one is going to get away with this." Sophie nodded, squeezing Emma's hand tightly. "We'll get through this," she whispered, though deep down, she wasn't so sure. For the first time, Sophie realized that their world had been irrevocably changed, and Karen McDonald had pushed them to the breaking point. The sound of screeching tires outside cut through the heavy silence in the Bennett home. Sophie, still holding Emma tightly, glanced toward the window, her heart hammering in her chest. The sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Finally, someone was here to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded. But deep down, Sophie knew this wasn't going to be as simple as just reporting the crime. Karen McDonald had a way of twisting every situation, of manipulating her way out of trouble. Sophie could feel it in her bones. The officers might show up, but would they see Karen for who she really was? As the front door opened and two uniformed officers stepped into the room, the tension in the air grew thicker. One officer, a tall man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, immediately scanned the room. His eyes settled on Sophie and Liam, then moved to the shattered window. The second officer, a younger woman, was taking notes, her expression stern but sympathetic. "Ma'am, sir, we've received reports of a shooting. Are you both all right?" the officer asked, his voice calm yet authoritative. Sophie nodded, her breath shaky as she spoke. "We're fine. I mean, physically, yes. But Karen McDonald, she shot at us, right through the window." The officer nodded and motioned to the shattered glass. "I see. And what exactly happened? Did you see her?" Before Sophie could answer, the sound of footsteps outside interrupted the moment. Karen McDonald, as calm as ever, stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation. Sophie's stomach twisted at the sight of her. The same self-righteous look, the same posture of someone who believed they were untouchable. "I'm sorry, officers," Karen said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed, "but I don't know why we're wasting time here. I had no choice but to defend myself." She turned to Sophie, a cruel smile curling on her lips. "This woman is dangerous, officer. I've been telling her for months to follow the rules, and she's ignored every warning. I feared for my safety." Sophie's blood boiled. She opened her mouth to speak, but the officer cut her off, raising a hand to silence her. "Let's keep this civil, ma'am." Sophie clenched her fists, feeling the sting of helplessness. She wanted to scream, to tear into Karen's lies, but she held back. The last thing she wanted was to appear unstable in front of the officers. Karen's words were laced with manipulation, but the worst part was that Sophie knew they'd carry weight. Karen had the power of the HOA behind her. She could twist this situation to her advantage, and the officers would believe her. "I had no choice," Karen continued, her voice growing more insistent. "She was threatening me. I had to protect myself." The officer turned to Liam, who was standing by, trying to hold his frustration in check. "Did you see the altercation?" the officer asked. Liam, his jaw tight, nodded. "I saw Karen standing there talking to Sophie. There was no threat. Sophie wasn't threatening her. Karen just pulled out a gun. I saw the whole thing." Karen interrupted, her voice dripping with feigned indignation. "He's lying. I was just standing my ground. They're trying to make me the villain here." Sophie could feel the walls closing in. Karen's version of the story was carefully crafted, and she could tell the officers were beginning to doubt her own account. The officer, a skeptical look on his face, turned to Karen. "Is that so?" he asked. "We'll need to take your statement as well." Karen, sensing the shift, nodded with practiced calm. "Of course. I'm just trying to protect my community. These people have no respect for the rules, and it's been escalating for months." She looked over at Sophie, her gaze cold. "I had to do what I did to keep the peace." The young officer, who had been quietly jotting down notes, raised an eyebrow. "So, you're claiming self-defense?" Karen nodded, the mask of innocence still firmly in place. "Yes, officer. And I've been trying to get them to follow the rules for months. They're out of control." Sophie's frustration bubbled over. "That's not what happened. Karen, you came here to start a fight. You shot through our window at my daughter and me." The officer gave her a firm look, but it wasn't one of support. It was the look of someone trying to keep the peace in a situation where both sides had a claim. "Ma'am, please let me handle this." Sophie's heart sank. She wanted to scream, to expose Karen for the manipulator she was, but in that moment, Karen's words hung in the air like a fog. She was the one being listened to, the one with power. Sophie was just the mother trying to protect her family. Can we please focus on the evidence? The older officer asked, his voice firm. The glass is broken, and we'll need to examine the trajectory of the bullet. I'm sure there's more to this than what's been said. Sophie nodded. But even as the officers moved to inspect the scene, she felt a sense of dread creeping into her chest. What if Karen's lies were enough to convince them? What if they couldn't get justice for what she had done? The officers continued questioning both parties, their expressions grim as they processed the conflicting stories. As the minutes stretched on, Sophie's heart ached with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The fight for her family's safety wasn't over, it had just begun. The weight of what had happened was still heavy in the air, thick like the dust that settled in the corners of the Bennett home. Sophie sat in the living room, the shattered window before her a stark reminder of the attack. The police had taken their statements, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the truth wasn't fully in their grasp yet. Karen's version of events, filled with lies and manipulation, still hung over them like a dark cloud. Liam had already started combing through the details, his mind, always analytical, shifted into investigation mode the moment the police left. He knew that in a case like this, they had to find every shred of evidence to expose Karen's lies. It wasn't just about self-defense, it was about proving that Karen had premeditated the attack. Sophie watched him as he typed away on his laptop, pulling up HOA records and combing through the history of complaints and disputes in the neighborhood. Sophie, feeling the pressure mounting, grabbed her phone and started scrolling through recent calls, emails, and texts. She knew that Karen's long history of petty complaints against them might be the key to unraveling the whole thing. Every email Karen had sent about their violations could paint a picture of a woman obsessed with control, someone who would stop at nothing to make their lives miserable. She was interrupted by Emma's voice from the kitchen, surprising Sophie. Emma had always been more reserved, not one to rush into action during moments like this. But now there was a spark in her eyes, a look of quiet determination. "Mom, I've been thinking," Emma began, her voice steady despite the weight of everything that had happened. "We have a security camera in the front yard. I remember seeing it last week when I was outside. What if it caught the moment Karen shot at us?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. It was a long shot, but it was exactly the kind of breakthrough they needed. The security camera had been pointed toward the driveway, right where Karen had stood. If it had captured the moment, they would have irrefutable proof. "I didn't even think of that, Emma," Sophie said, a wave of relief washing over her. "Let's check the footage." Sophie and Emma quickly moved to the small corner of the living room where the security system monitor was mounted. Emma worked the controls with surprising efficiency, her fingers moving over the buttons and screens as if she had done this 100 times. Sophie marveled at her daughter's resilience, at how, despite everything she had gone through, she was standing tall in the face of adversity. The screen flickered to life, displaying the feed from the front yard. Sophie held her breath as the footage scrolled back to the time of the shooting. They watched in silence, the tension thick in the air as Emma rewound and fast-forwarded, looking for the exact moment Karen appeared. Finally, they saw it. There, in the dim light of the evening, Karen's figure emerged from the shadows, walking briskly toward the front door. She was talking, but the camera angle was poor, so the audio was muffled. But then, they saw her pull out the gun, aiming it directly at the window. Sophie's heart stopped as she saw the flash of the shot. The moment the bullet hit, the camera caught the brief glimpse of Karen's face, twisted in anger and intent. The entire scene unfolded before them like a movie. It was undeniable proof of Karen's actions. "This is it," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. "This is what we need." But the footage wasn't the only thing Sophie needed. She turned to Emma, who had already pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts. "We need witnesses," Sophie said, feeling a new surge of determination. "Someone must have seen something." "I know," Emma replied, her eyes scanning the screen. "I'll reach out to a few people who might have been outside that night. Maybe they heard something, or they were walking nearby." Sophie nodded, the weight on her shoulders feeling lighter now. "Let's get this all together. We can't let Karen get away with this." Liam, who had been listening quietly, turned to Sophie, a glint of hope in his eyes. We're not letting her off the hook. We've got the footage, and if Emma can get those witnesses, we'll have a strong case. For the first time since the attack, Sophie felt a spark of hope. They weren't powerless in this. They had the truth on their side, and with determination, they could turn this nightmare around. As Emma sent out her messages and Liam continued to dig through the HOA records, Sophie felt the pieces falling into place. They had a long road ahead, but for the first time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. They were going to fight back and they were going to win. The tension in the room was palpable as Karen McDonald walked into the HOA meeting. Her heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor, her gaze steely and focused, her posture that of someone with an unshakable sense of entitlement. The room, filled with members of the Homeowners Association, quieted at her arrival, the conversations dying down as if they were waiting for a performance. And in many ways they were. Karen had already made up her mind. She was going to play the victim, and she intended to do it with precision. Sophie sat at the back of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her pulse racing as she waited for Karen to begin spinning her narrative. The room, once a place of calm neighborhood meetings, now felt like an arena where they were about to witness a battle that would determine the future of their family safety. Karen's voice sliced through the silence, smooth and practiced. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her words dripping with politeness, but there was a hidden venom in them. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, landing briefly on Sophie and Liam, seated at the far end. "I'm afraid I've come today under rather disturbing circumstances." Her eyes narrowed as she turned toward the board members, her tone growing more somber. "You see, I've tried for months to address the issues with the Bennetts, but they simply refuse to cooperate. It's as though they think they're above the rules, above the community. This latest incident, well, I can't even begin to explain how dangerous it's become." She paused again, taking a deep breath for effect, her fingers lightly tapping on the folder she had brought. Sophie's blood boiled at the sight of her. The image Karen was crafting was a far cry from the truth. Karen's hands were far from clean. And yet here she was, turning herself into the righteous crusader, fighting against the chaos that the Bennetts represented. The manipulation was flawless. Karen continued, her voice filled with feigned emotion. "I had no choice but to take action. I've been patient with them, tried to work within the system, but nothing works. They break every rule, ignore every warning, and now they've threatened my safety." She let her words hang in the air, heavy with accusation. "Just yesterday, I was forced to defend myself. Imagine after everything I've done to try to resolve the issues, they respond with such aggression. It's simply unacceptable." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as Karen's words spun out like a web, tangling the truth into a convoluted story of victimhood. The audacity, the pure, calculated effort to twist the narrative was enough to make Sophie's blood run cold. Karen was portraying herself as a saint, a homeowner who had only acted in self-defense, when in reality, she had been the aggressor. Karen made a show of her fake distress, her hand pressed to her chest in mock sincerity. "I was just trying to protect myself, protect this community." But they refused to listen. "I never wanted it to escalate like this." Her gaze flicked back to Sophie and Liam, lingering for a moment too long, like a hunter savoring the moment before taking the kill. "I only took the necessary steps when it became clear that they couldn't control their behavior. And now we're all left in this situation." Sophie clenched her fists, the muscles in her arms tightening with rage. Karen was trying to frame them as troublemakers, as the cause of all the discord in the neighborhood. She was painting them as violent, uncontrollable, when it was Karen's own actions that had driven everything to this point. The gall of it all, how could Karen twist the truth so effortlessly, and how were the HOA members falling for it? The room was silent, and Sophie could almost hear the board members muttering among themselves, beginning to buy into Karen's version of events. It was all too easy for them to believe that the Bennetts were troublemakers. After all, they had always been seen as the ones who didn't fit in with the perfect, pristine image of the neighborhood. They were the ones with the problem child, the one in a wheelchair, the ones who had caused disruptions in Karen's ideal world. Sophie felt the weight of their gazes, their judgmental stares, and for the first time, she truly felt how isolated they were in this fight. I'm afraid we're dealing with a larger issue than just property violations, Karen continued, her voice gaining momentum. This is about safety, and I'm not sure the Bennetts understand just how dangerous this situation has become. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked. We must take a stand before it escalates even further. There it was, the subtle threat, the veiled warning that the community would turn against them if they didn't conform. Karen knew exactly how to manipulate the HOA's fear, how to feed into their desire to keep the peace at any cost. Sophie could see the unease in the faces of the board members. Karen was working her charm, playing them like a puppet master. And as much as Sophie hated it, it was working. Karen's words were poison, and with each syllable, she cast a shadow over the Bennetts. I think it's clear what needs to happen here, Karen concluded, her voice firm, yet dripping with false concern. We need to take immediate action to ensure the safety of this community. I've already filed a formal report, and I'll be taking this matter to the authorities if necessary. We cannot wait for something worse to happen. Sophie's breath hitched. This wasn't just about a petty HOA violation anymore. This was Karen's attempt to destroy them, to isolate them completely from the community, to make them the pariahs. Karen's manipulation was in full force, and she wasn't going to stop until she had won. Sophie turned to Liam, her heart pounding in her chest. He met her gaze, and the silent understanding between them was clear. They had to fight back. They had no choice. But the question lingered in the back of Sophie's mind. Would the HOA be able to see through Karen's lies before it was too late? The battle was far from over. And this was just the beginning. The day had stretched on in a blur of phone calls, emails, and frustrated attempts to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her eyes sore from hours of scanning through documents and neighborhood records, trying to piece together the puzzle of Karen McDonald's twisted narrative. It felt like they were constantly one step behind, always reacting, never quite able to get ahead of Karen's manipulations. But then, as the evening light began to fade, Sophie stumbled upon something that made her heart race, something that could finally turn the tide in their favor. She had been going through HOA minutes and old complaint records, searching for any mention of Karen's involvement. It was tedious work, flicking through document after document, but Sophie's eyes were determined. Karen's reign over the neighborhood had been built on her ability to control and intimidate, and Sophie knew that if they were to have any chance of fighting back, they needed to expose the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. And then she found it, a small, innocuous-looking report buried deep in the HOA archives. At first, it seemed insignificant, a complaint filed about a neighborly dispute. But as Sophie dug deeper, the weight of it hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a minor squabble. It was an entire history of complaints against Karen. Over the years, there had been multiple instances where Karen had used her power to intimidate and even physically threaten other residents. There were accusations of her vandalizing neighbors' property, trying to force people out of their homes under the guise of enforcing HOA rules, and even reports of her physically shoving someone during a neighborhood meeting. Sophie's fingers trembled as she clicked through page after page, the evidence mounting with every line she read. Her heart pounded in her chest. It was like a dam had broken open. Everything she had suspected about Karen's manipulations was now undeniable. Karen had a long history of abusing her position, and Sophie had the proof. The question was, how could they use this to their advantage? Sophie glanced over her shoulder, her mind racing. Liam was in the living room, still poring over legal options, but this was the key they'd been looking for. She stood up quickly, her breath coming faster as she grabbed the printouts and rushed into the living room. Liam looked up, surprised by her urgency. His face softened when he saw the pile of documents in her hand. "What is it?" Liam asked, his voice a mix of concern and curiosity. He could see the intensity in her eyes. This was no ordinary find. This, Sophie said, her voice shaking slightly as she handed him the papers, this changes everything. Liam scanned the papers quickly, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. He turned to her, his expression shifting from disbelief to quiet satisfaction. This is it, he muttered, almost to himself. This is the leverage we need. Sophie nodded, her heart still racing. She had suspected Karen for a while. But this was something tangible. It wasn't just their word against Karen's anymore. They had evidence that Karen had used her power to harm others, to break rules, and to violate the very principles the HOA was supposed to uphold. This wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. But as the relief flooded through her, a new concern settled in. Could they make this evidence count? Could they convince the authorities, the HOA, even the neighbors who had blindly followed Karen, to see her for who she really was? What do we do with this now? Sophie asked, her voice quiet, almost fearful of the answer. Liam's eyes met hers, his jaw set with determination. We take it straight to the board. We go over Karen's history with them, show them the pattern of abuse. This isn't just about what happened to us. It's about what she's been doing for years. If we can get enough people to back us up, we can expose her for what she truly is, a bully with too much power. Sophie nodded, her hands still shaking as she sat down beside him. For the first time since the incident, she felt a flicker of hope. They weren't just going to sit back and let Karen manipulate everything in their lives. They had a way to fight back now. They had the truth on their side. The room was filled with a tense silence as they looked over the documents together. The weight of the situation hadn't quite lifted, but now there was a sense of clarity. They had a plan. They had something real to bring to the table. But even as Sophie allowed herself a moment to breathe, a nagging thought tugged at her. Karen wasn't the type to go down easily. Sophie knew her well enough to understand that Karen would do everything in her power to twist this, to make herself appear as the victim once again. They couldn't afford to be complacent. This was just the beginning. What if it's not enough? Sophie asked quietly, the uncertainty creeping back in. Liam took her hand, his grip firm. It will be enough. We've got the evidence. Now, we just need to make sure the right people hear it. Sophie nodded, a sense of resolve settling in her chest. They weren't powerless anymore. They had the truth, and that was all they needed to take Karen down. As they prepared to move forward, Sophie couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. The battle was far from over, but they had finally found their weapon. And for the first time, the odds seemed to be in their favor. The meeting room was filled with an uncomfortable silence, the air thick with tension. The HOA board members sat at a long table, their faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and judgment. Sophie and Liam Bennett stood at the front, their eyes scanning the room as they prepared to present the evidence that could change everything. This wasn't just another HOA meeting. This was the culmination of everything they had been fighting for: justice, truth, and the chance to clear their names. But it felt like an uphill battle. Karen MacDonald, sitting near the back of the room, watched them with an inscrutable expression, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her presence was a looming threat, and Sophie could feel her eyes boring into her with a mixture of disdain and confidence. Karen had always been the golden child of the HOA, a woman who had the power to manipulate and control. But today, it was time for that power to be exposed for what it truly was. Sophie took a deep breath, glancing at Liam, who gave her a reassuring nod. He had always been the calm in their storm, the anchor that kept them grounded, but Sophie knew this was their moment. If they didn't convince the board now, if they didn't make them see the truth, everything they had fought for would be in vain. The president of the HOA, a man named Greg Walters, cleared his throat and addressed the room. We're here today to discuss the ongoing situation between the Bennetts and Mrs. MacDonald. Sophie, Liam, you may present your case. His tone was neutral, but there was an underlying unease in his voice. It was clear that the board didn't know what to make of the situation, and their discomfort was palpable. Liam stepped forward, his posture strong and unwavering. "Thank you, Greg," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He turned to the room, addressing the board members directly. "We're here today because of one simple reason. We've been wronged. For months, Karen McDonald has used her position in the HOA to target our family. She's used her authority to manipulate, bully, and try to force us out of this community. And now, she's escalated to violence. We've had enough." Sophie felt a surge of pride as Liam spoke. His words were calm, but they carried the weight of everything they had endured. She knew that they had to stay composed, that they couldn't let the emotional weight of everything they had been through cloud their judgment. This was about facts, about showing the board the truth. Liam pulled out a folder, the pages of evidence neatly organized. "This is the evidence we've gathered," he continued. "Emails, complaints, and reports. For years, Karen has been using the HOA to settle personal grievances, making life miserable for anyone who dares to disagree with her. But this," he held up the security footage of the shooting, "this is the final straw. We have video evidence showing that Karen McDonald fired a gun at her home. At my wife, at my daughter. There is no denying what she did. And yet, she stands here pretending to be the victim." The room fell silent as the board members absorbed the gravity of Liam's words. Sophie could see the shock on their faces, their disbelief quickly turning into something else. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected to be confronted with the truth. Karen stood up suddenly, her face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice shrill. "They're twisting everything. I'm the one who's been threatened here. I'm just trying to protect my home, my community." She turned to the board members, her hands gesturing wildly. "You can't believe them. They're nothing but troublemakers." Sophie felt her blood boil, but she kept her composure. She had to. This wasn't just about defending herself. It was about making sure that Karen's manipulations couldn't reach the board. Liam spoke again, his voice cutting through Karen's rant. "Karen, you've had your say. Now, it's our turn to show the truth. You can stand there and lie, but the evidence doesn't lie. You used your power to control, to bully, and to hurt people. And now you've taken it too far. We are asking the board to take action, to stop letting you use the HOA as your personal weapon." The tension in the room was thick, each board member glancing around at each other, unsure of how to respond. Sophie could feel the uncertainty mounting as Karen's angry words filled the air. It was clear that the board was divided. Some were starting to see the truth, but others, especially those who had long been under Karen's influence, were hesitant to believe it. Greg Walters finally spoke up, his voice firm but thoughtful. "We will review the evidence and take this into consideration. The board will deliberate privately and reach a decision." Sophie's stomach dropped. This wasn't the final verdict. This wasn't over yet. "We understand," Liam replied, his voice calm but with a note of finality. "But let it be clear that we will not back down. We've fought for our family's safety, and we'll continue to fight for what's right." As the meeting adjourned and the board members began filing out, Sophie exchanged a look with Liam. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the brink of something big. The truth had been laid bare, and they had done everything they could to expose Karen's manipulations. Now, all they could do was wait. Would the board stand with them, or would they continue to let Karen control everything? The suspense hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The public hearing room was packed with anxious neighbors, HOA board members, and a handful of curious onlookers. The atmosphere felt electric, charged with anticipation. Sophie and Liam Bennett sat in the front row, hands clenched tightly, hearts pounding in their chests. They had come this far, faced so many obstacles, and now it all came down to this moment, the final showdown. The sound of hushed whispers filled the room as the board members took their seats, their expressions serious, their gazes flicking between the Bennetts and Karen McDonald, who sat with her usual air of arrogance at the front. Karen was poised as ever, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, wearing her trademark mask of controlled confidence. It was as if she thought she had already won. Sophie could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, the injustice of it all still fresh in her mind. Karen had made their lives hell, manipulated everyone around her, and yet here she was still holding on to her power with a tight grip. Greg Walters, the HOA president, called the room to order. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. We are gathered to discuss the situation involving the Bennetts and Mrs. McDonald. The board has reviewed the evidence presented, and we are now ready to hear final statements before we proceed to a vote. Sophie felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. This was it, the culmination of everything they had fought for. They had the truth on their side, the evidence, the witnesses, and their own strength. But she knew that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. The manipulative woman would do everything in her power to make it look like she was the one in the right. Liam stood up first, his voice steady and resolute. "Thank you, Greg," he began, his tone firm. "We're here today, not just for ourselves, but for everyone in this community who has been silenced, ignored, or intimidated by Karen McDonald. For years, she has used her position as HOA president to bully and control others. She's manipulated every rule, every system to suit her own agenda. And when we refused to bow to her demands, she escalated her behavior to violence. That's not something anyone should stand for." The room was silent, the weight of Liam's words sinking in. Sophie watched the faces of the board members, some of them nodding, others looking uncomfortable as the truth finally began to settle over the room. For so long, Karen had been untouchable, her manipulations woven so deeply into the fabric of the community that no one dared challenge her. But now the walls were crumbling. Liam continued, his voice rising with conviction. "We've shown you the evidence, the security footage, the history of complaints, the witnesses. Karen's actions speak for themselves. She has abused her power for far too long, and she's shown no remorse for the harm she's caused. It's time for her to be held accountable." Karen shot up from her seat, her eyes blazing with fury. "This is preposterous," she shouted, her voice shrill. "I'm the one who's been wronged here. I'm just trying to keep this community safe, to maintain some semblance of order. She pointed accusingly at Sophie and Liam. "They've done nothing but stir up trouble. They're the ones who don't belong here." Sophie stood up then, her voice cutting through the chaos with a calmness that only came from years of bottled-up frustration. "Karen, you don't get to twist the truth anymore. We've seen who you really are. We've heard your lies, your threats, your manipulations. You're not protecting this community, you're controlling it for your own gain. And we won't stand by while you destroy everything we've worked for." The room was dead silent now, every eye on Karen as her face flushed red with anger. Sophie and Liam had spoken the truth, and it was impossible to ignore. The board members exchanged glances, some of them looking ashamed, others shocked by the sheer audacity of Karen's behavior. Greg Walters cleared his throat, his voice now firm as he addressed Karen. "Mrs. McDonald, your actions have been thoroughly reviewed. The evidence is clear, and we can no longer ignore the harm you've caused. You've violated the trust of this community, and your behavior has proven that you are unfit to hold the position of HOA president." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as though she were searching for words that wouldn't come. "You can't do this," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "I've built this neighborhood. I've kept everything in order. You can't just take that away from me." But the room had already made up its mind. One by one, the board members nodded in agreement. Greg Walters stood up, his voice solemn but resolute. "The decision has been made. Mrs. McDonald, you are hereby removed from your position as HOA president, effective immediately. Your actions have been deemed unacceptable, and your membership in this community is hereby revoked." The room erupted into murmurs of surprise and disbelief. Sophie and Liam stood frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened. They had won. The community had seen through Karen's lies, and justice had been served. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on Sophie's shoulders lifted, and she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Karen's face twisted in anger and humiliation as she grabbed her belongings, slamming the folder down onto the table with a loud crash. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice full of venom. "I'll make sure you regret this." But it didn't matter. Karen's power was gone. The community had seen the truth, and there was no turning back. As she stormed out of the room, Sophie turned to Liam, her eyes shining with both relief and triumph. "We did it," Sophie whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Liam pulled her into a tight hug, his own eyes glistening with pride. "We did," he said softly. "We finally won." As they stood there, the weight of the battle finally behind them, Sophie knew this wasn't just a victory for them. It was a victory for everyone in the neighborhood who had been bullied, manipulated, or intimidated by Karen. The community had come together, and for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt like they had truly found their place in the world. The sun was setting on a quiet evening, casting a warm golden hue over the Bennett family home. After everything that had happened, the house, which had once felt like a battlefield, now seemed to embrace them with a newfound sense of peace. The storm had passed, and though the scars of the past weeks remained, they no longer felt insurmountable. The front yard, once a battleground between them and the HOA, now felt like a symbol of resilience, a place where they could finally breathe without fear. Sophie sat on the porch, the gentle breeze rustling the trees around her, while Liam was inside, packing away the last of the papers from the HOA meeting. Emma was in her wheelchair, rolling along the driveway, her smile brighter than Sophie had seen in a long time. The world had felt like it was closing in on them for so long, but now it felt different. For the first time in months, Sophie allowed herself to relax. They had fought the hardest fight of their lives, and they had emerged victorious. Liam stepped out onto the porch, joining Sophie and Emma. He stood beside Sophie, resting a hand on her shoulder as they watched Emma laugh, her carefree spirit shining through. "It's hard to believe it's over," Liam said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of relief and awe. "After everything, we're finally free." Sophie nodded, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I still can't believe we won. After everything Karen put us through, I thought we'd never make it. But here we are." The weight of it all hadn't fully sunk in until now. The emotional toll, the constant battles, the sleepless nights, wondering if they were ever going to get out from under Karen's grip, it had all been worth it. They had stood up for themselves, for Emma, and for the peace of mind they so desperately needed. The fight had been long. But now, as Sophie sat on the porch with her family, it felt like they were finally in control of their lives again. "I'm proud of us," Liam said, his voice thick with emotion, "not just for the victory, but for how we stuck together. We didn't let anything tear us apart." Sophie's heart swelled as she looked at her family. They had been through so much, but in the end, they had emerged stronger than ever. "We're stronger than we thought," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "And we didn't do it alone. We had each other, and we had the people who believed in us." It wasn't just the victory over Karen that Sophie cherished, it was the way the community had come together. In the aftermath of the hearing, neighbors had reached out, some who had been silent for years, others who had been too afraid to speak up. They showed solidarity in ways Sophie hadn't expected. Many had quietly supported the Bennetts behind the scenes, and now they were ready to stand up against the injustice Karen had wrought. The neighborhood wasn't just a collection of houses anymore. It was a community, one that had shown that even in the face of tyranny, strength could be found in unity. As the days passed, things slowly began to return to normal. The community held meetings without fear of being bullied. People started talking to one another again, neighbors who had once kept to themselves, now engaging in conversations that were filled with warmth and respect. Karen's influence was gone, and the peace that had been long denied was beginning to settle back into the streets. But it wasn't just the neighborhood that had changed. Sophie could feel a new sense of purpose in her heart. She had fought for her family, for their rights, and for the peace they deserved. And in doing so, she had discovered strength within herself that she hadn't known existed. Sophie watched Emma, her daughter laughing and chatting with a neighbor who had come by to check on them. And she knew deep down that the battle had been worth it. The fight had been hard, but it had brought them closer together as a family. No longer would they allow anyone, Karen or anyone else, to push them into silence. "Mom, Dad," Emma called, rolling back toward the porch with a wide grin on her face. "I made a new friend today. Can we invite her over for dinner?" Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course, sweetie," she said, her voice full of love. "We'll make sure she feels welcome." Liam chuckled, his arm around Sophie's shoulders as they watched their daughter. "Life's looking a lot brighter now, isn't it?" Sophie leaned her head against Liam's shoulder, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. "It really is," she said softly. "It really is," as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Sophie knew that while the battle was over, the real work was just beginning. They had their peace back, but they would never take it for granted again. They had fought for it, and they had won. Moving forward, they would never stop fighting for the family they had built, the community they had helped rebuild, and the strength they had found within themselves. The storm had passed, and now it was time to rebuild their lives stronger than ever.